pensar para os senhores e para as senhoras no meio ambiente é, de fato, pensar em nosso futuro, certo? Sou um pouquinho desconfortável para vocês pensarem que a nossa espécie pode ser consumida se a gente não focar no planeta ainda hoje. Não ontem, mas hoje, não lá na frente, hoje. E mais, essa pauta ambiental, ela pode sim e deve ser um acelerador da economia com novos padrões de competitividade, né? Hoje o Brasil, eu vou trazer alguns dados para vocês, está na 87ª posição no ranking de desenvolvimento humano da Organização das Nações Unidas. Olha só, são um pouco mais de 10 milhões de desempregados no país. A gente está falando de 29,6% da população brasileira, ou seja, 92,9 milhões de pessoas, quase 93 milhões de pessoas que estão vivendo com a renda abaixo dos R$ 497. Vou trazer mais dados. Em relação ao meio ambiente, os dados foram levantados pelo Índice de Desempenho Ambiental, que é o ranking de desenvolvimento pelas universidades de Columbia e Yale University, né, que demonstram que o Brasil é o 4º pior país no mundo quando a gente fala de reciclagem. É o 9º pior país do mundo quando a gente fala de emissão de gases do efeito estufa. E o Brasil, num ranking de 180 países, ficou apenas em 114 quando a gente fala de perda florestal. São vários e vários desafios, a gente sabe muito bem, mas são pelo menos 2 grandes desafios que refletem o quanto a agenda que vai ser tratada hoje é de suma importância para a nação, para o país, né? Então, há muitas demandas diferentes, setores econômicos, acima de tudo, que vão da troca da matriz energética até, é claro, os investimentos para a preservação dos ativos florestais do país. E a tecnologia tem, claro, o seu papel fundamental para a gente apostar nessas soluções, acima de tudo, no aproveitamento desses recursos hídricos e também das florestas. Então, de acordo com a Organização Mundial agora do Trabalho, a substituição de combustíveis fósseis por energias mais renováveis vai provocar uma revolução por completa quando a gente fala do mercado de trabalho no mundo inteiro. A economia verde, que é o assunto que a gente vai, acima de tudo, abordar, obviamente, pode criar até 18 milhões de novos empregos, isso a gente está falando num período até 2030, está batendo na porta, né? Mas os futuros dirigentes políticos, muitos, é claro, obrigado por estarem aqui presentes, né, bem como o setor privado também deste país, devem, acima de tudo, investir. E quando a gente fala em investimento, investimento em políticas tributárias, de crédito e também investimentos que estimulem essa criação de novos postos de trabalho, dessa geração que a gente está falando de renda, da inclusão, acima de tudo, extremamente importante, social, e que vão aumentar a arrecadação em sintonia, não pode deixar de lado, com essa convergência, com a política climática e a política ambiental. Tem que andar junto, tem que caminhar junto. Inclusive, como vocês puderam assistir no início deste encontro, que a gente transmitiu diversos cases da iniciativa privada que fazem parte da rede, da Comunitas e que promovem, acima de tudo, ações para o desenvolvimento dessa agenda, com ações práticas, viáveis e principalmente sustentáveis, né? Então, para a gente começar essa nossa roda de conversa, nosso bate-papo, nossa interação, troca de ideias, e para nos apoiar e dar, obviamente, mais insights sobre o debate aqui no Brasil, a gente vai convidar para uma fala extremamente provocativa o autor dos livros Renewable Energy, a Prime for the 21st Century, e também o mais recente, Invest in the Era of Climate Change, que será, obviamente, lançado este ano. Então, eu chamo direto de lá, de Nova York, o nosso convidado, Usher. Hey Bruce, how are you? Thanks a lot for have you here with us. It's a good pleasure. Be very welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me there. I can see a very large screen in my picture. But thank you for inviting me to speak with you this afternoon. And you mentioned my controversial topics, my controversial talk. I don't know if it's controversial or simply factual. And maybe today having facts can be controversial. I'm going to speak for just 10 minutes, and I believe we have a few minutes for questions. I'd be very happy to take any questions at that point. In those 10 minutes, I want to discuss 3 topics. So I'm going to go quite quickly into those topics. The first is, why is now the right time to finance climate change solutions? The second topic is, what climate solutions does Brazil have a competitive advantage in? And the third, and perhaps the most important topic, is, why does investing matter for climate change? But before I get into those points, let's first understand the magnitude of the climate challenge. For 300 years, since the Industrial Revolution, as I'm sure you all know, we have built a global economy that has been quite successful. The average person today is 50 times as well off as the average person before the Industrial Revolution. And the agricultural revolution contributed to that as well. The challenge, again, as I think you know, is in creating the industrial and agricultural revolutions, we've been emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the climate scientists, many of whom are here at Columbia University working with me, they tell us that to avoid catastrophic climate change, which is a warming of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, we need to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions to 0 by 2050, no later than 2070. We need to totally decarbonize our entire global economy, that after 300 years of increasing emissions, we have 30 years to reduce them, which may seem like an impossible task. So I'm often asked the question, can we avoid catastrophic climate change? And my response is, we can. That doesn't mean we will. So let me first address the first issue of, why is now the right time for investors to finance climate change solutions? And the answer is that there are 4 global trends occurring now that make decarbonization by 2050 possible. And the first of those trends is a manifestation of physical risks of climate change. It's finally getting the public's attention. Extreme heat events in Europe, wildfires in the United States, violent storms in East Asia, flooding in Pakistan, and Brazil. As you know better than I do, we have drying in some places, intense rainfall in others, deadly mudslides only earlier this year, or last year. Climate change is increasingly viewed as a real and present danger. And because of the rising physical risk of climate change, we have changing social norms. My colleagues here at Columbia have studied how employees view their employers and find that employees prefer to work for companies that they view as sustainable. Similarly, consumers show a marked preference to purchase what they believe are sustainable products. And voters are now showing that preference as well. A study at Yale showed that 61% of Brazilians are worried about climate change. So because of these first 2 trends, the physical risk of climate change and now changing social norms, we now start to see government action. Here in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act is the biggest piece of legislation on climate change ever. We have many, many states here in the United States, both Republican and Democratic states, taking action around renewable energy and climate. And of course, in Europe, China, India, and elsewhere, we see government action. Government, of course, is not consistent. It is haphazard. In Brazil, government support has not always been strong. But the overall global trend is very clear. There is increasingly government action and regulation on climate change. And then we get to the fourth and the most important trend. And this is the one I actually want to talk about in more detail. And this is the rapid innovation in products that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, specifically products that are substitutes for existing polluting products. Substitutes, it's an economic term, but simply it means a product that has an equal or lower price than the current product, or it provides equal or better performance. And let me explain why this is very important. When I began investing in climate change mitigation, this was 20 years ago, there was very little to invest in. Renewable energy was costly. It was uncompetitive with fossil fuels. If you added up all the solar installations in the world at that time, they generated less power than one coal-fired plant. And as for electric vehicles, they really were non-existent. 20 years ago, there was no path for reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 0 without sending the global economy back to a pre-industrial age. Now, we're in a very different situation. Today, renewable solar and wind are the fastest growing sources of new power generation on the planet because they are the cheapest source of electricity. They provide a competitive substitute to coal and natural gas and oil. And the renewable energy sector has reached scale. Last year alone, more solar, just solar, was installed than more than 100 coal plants of power production. And electric vehicle sales have passed 25% in Europe and are forecast to take 20% of new vehicle sales in China. China is the world's largest automobile market. These products, renewable energy and electric vehicles, are gaining market share rapidly because they are better substitutes than the existing product. People buy them because they're cheaper, in case of renewables, or because they handle better. People who drive electric cars prefer them, but faster. Successful investors are well aware of these trends, and there's no more certain long-term trend than climate change. In a time of market volatility, which is we are experiencing in global markets today, more than a decade, investors seeing these long-term trends around climate change, these 4 trends that I mentioned, and channeling capital into these climate solutions. More capital continues to flow into these sectors than ever before, even with all of the market activity, all the market volatility that we're experiencing. So what are the implications of these trends for Brazil? Most of the discussion around climate change and Brazil centers on deforestation of the Amazon. That's where the discussion always seems to lead. But we need to consider all of Brazil's economy and geography and understand, as you know better than I do, that there are 3 unique attributes of Brazil that position it well to compete in this changing global economy. The first is your clean power sector, because of your leadership around hydro. 78% of your power is from clean energy, more than twice the US today. Second is your experience with biofuels at scale, the only country to do so in the world. And the third is your experience with nature-based solutions for carbon capture. Given these unique attributes, and these are unique to Brazil, Brazilian entrepreneurs and investors should focus on opportunities in green hydrogen, in biofuels, and in nature-based carbon capture solutions. Why green hydrogen? Because the key to green hydrogen is very cheap, clean energy, renewable energy. You have the leadership in hydro, you have potential in wind, you certainly have potential in solar, given the radiation, because of your location. You're already at scale in clean energy. This positions Brazil to develop a green hydrogen export industry, exporting hydrogen to Europe or other countries. In biofuels, the demand is coming already from the airline industry to use sustainable aviation fuels to transition away from kerosene. Given Brazil's experience with biofuels, ethanol specifically, potential there for real leadership in that sector. And lastly, around land and agricultural management. Nature-based carbon capture is a rapidly growing industry because it's the most effective way for companies to offset emissions that they cannot reduce internally. I would also add a 4th sector that's worth exploring, but is very challenging today, and that's the whole area of direct air capture. This is using very advanced technologies to capture CO2 out of the atmosphere using renewable energy. It's very energy intensive, and again, Brazil's leadership in renewables is a competitive advantage here, but direct air capture today is very challenging and not yet competitive. Brazilian businesses have the opportunity to leverage Brazil's competitive advantages in these areas to both generate attractive investment opportunities and to contribute to reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. Which brings me to my 3rd and final topic, why investment matters. So avoiding a climate catastrophe requires implementation of these climate solutions at an unprecedented pace and at global scale. And that will require investment capital, an estimated $125 trillion by 2050 to decarbonize the global economy and limit warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. And then analysis is from many leading firms, BCG, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, McKinsey. They all agreed around these numbers. I'm not making these numbers up. 125 trillion is a very large number, but in fact, it is only a doubling of current investments in this field in developed countries. It is a greater increase in developing countries, about a six-fold increase. But that capital does exist today. And in fact, that capital is seeking these kind of investment opportunities. It's already available and it's already being put into place. The public narrative around climate change today is that we are falling behind. We are not making any progress on climate change. This is simply not true. And this is where my writing may be slightly controversial. It is correct that we are falling behind in terms of global emissions. And it's correct that the time we have to address climate change is shortening. And this is extremely worrisome. Make no mistake, I'm very worried about our ability to avoid catastrophic climate change. But where the public narrative tends to go wrong is that countries today are already beginning to decarbonize at a rapid pace. A recent Bloomberg study added up the number of countries that are already decarbonizing. The leader in this case is Germany. More than 40% decrease in decarbonization in the past 30 years, while growing the real economy by 46%. Even the United States, which is not known as an environmental leader anywhere in the world, even the United States, greenhouse gas emissions peaked in 2007. We're already decarbonizing here, and dozens of other countries are as well. So can we reach net zero by 2050 or 2070? The combination of renewable energy and electric vehicles, if scaled globally, will reduce global emissions by 50% already. That gets us halfway to zero. That will require investment of trillions of dollars in capital, but the funding already exists. And investment dollars, in fact, are a misleading metric because the cost of many of these solutions like renewables keeps falling. The other 50%, those solutions are not yet commercial, but many of them are in the R&D stage. In fact, I would suspect many of the companies in the room today are looking at these new technologies. And these are promising technologies like green hydrogen. And they're receiving billions of dollars in investment through venture capitalists and other investors. The window for avoiding catastrophic climate change, it's very tight, and there are very significant challenges ahead. But the narrative that there's no progress on climate change, it's defeatist. It's a narrative that we should give up, that there's no hope. In order to defeat climate change, we need to do two things. And we need to do them faster. We need to scale the commercial solutions that exist, renewable energy and electric vehicles, to 100%. Business is very good at scaling, much better than government. Business must keep scaling. And we need innovation around the non-commercial solutions to get them, to make them commercial and to scale. And business is very good at innovation. That's the role of the business community. Let me conclude by saying that since I began work in the sector 20 years ago, climate change has grown significantly worse and less time remains to address it. But the technologies and the business models for reducing emissions have dramatically improved, offering a path for avoiding catastrophic climate change. Investing in the Era of Climate Change, the title of the book that I wrote, that describes that path and the critical role that investors and businesses play in navigating it. My hope in writing the book is that every investor, whether they're individual or institutional, will recognize the changes that are coming and act for their benefit and the benefit of all. So that concludes my remarks, and I believe we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks a lot for this explanation. It's very interesting. Now, yes, we have some questions for you. Tenho aqui a pergunta do senhor Clóvis Carvalho, do Instituto Votorantim, por favor. Acho que ele já está com o microfone.
Tá.
Bruce está também com retorno simultâneo, consegue entender o senhor numa boa. Por favor, Clóvis.
Tá bom, vou fazer minha pergunta em português. Muito obrigado, professor Bruce, pelas informações, apesar da gente sair daqui assustado, né, e preocupado. A minha pergunta é o seguinte: está muito claro que as soluções sustentáveis serão soluções construídas em rede, né, em parcerias aí entre primeiro, segundo e terceiro setor, e soluções que integrem o social e o ambiental. Na opinião do senhor, pelas reflexões, Quem deve puxar essas parcerias? Quem tem o papel de protagonismo e de puxar essas soluções?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Excellent question. I wish I could respond in Portuguese. I visit Brazil so many times, but unfortunately my Portuguese is very, very weak. So I don't believe we should rely on one leader. Historically, we've relied on the government to address negative externalities like climate change. Climate change is what we refer to as a negative externality in economics. And we rely on the government because that's a role of the government to solve these problems for society. But in the case of climate change, the problem is too complex. There are too many players, and the time is too short. And furthermore, what we find is most effective is that when government takes some action and business supports that action in a implementation way. As I mentioned earlier, business is very good at innovation and very good at scale. And then business shows some leadership and pushes government towards certain policies. And civil society plays a role as well. In other words, there's what we call a yin and a yang of these different stakeholders pushing each other to show advancement. We cannot just rely on the government sector because I have many concerns about our ability to address climate change. I said earlier in my talk, we can address it. We have the technologies, we have the capital. That doesn't mean we will. And my biggest concern is we do not have the will because governments are unable to cooperate with each other. We live in a world today where there's very little cooperation among national governments, and that situation is becoming more difficult each year. So, a long answer to your question. The important thing is not to rely on one sector to show real leadership. The business sector, the government, and civil society, nonprofits, and other organizations must constantly push each of these pieces ahead in a relationship that moves everything forward.
Okay. Bruce, thanks a lot. It was a real pleasure to have you here. Acho que foi muito bom essa conversa, essa troca para a gente já dar seguimento. Muito obrigado, Bruce. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.